G'day and welcome to Mark and Sam After Work. Today I want to go through fire forming and improved chambers in a basic form to let the novice and the people who haven't heard about this sort of stuff and I suppose everyone some general information to go with both those features. I've got some cases in front. They're going to help a little bit with what we're actually talking about in describing a couple of different options or a couple of different choices in that form. But to start off with, what is fire forming? Fire forming is what happens when you have a round in the chamber and you pull the trigger and it goes off, it sends the bullet out. There's a bang and it sends the bullet out. Well, what actually happens is there's a very high pressure explosion that happens inside the cartridge or inside the brass case, and that forces the brass out into the shape of the chamber. So in a standard chamber, so a normal rifle, a normal hunting rifle and that sort of thing, your chamber is going to be a few thou larger than your brass. So both in the cases or in the length, in general bits and pieces, there's a few thou involved in it and the brass is going to expand to that size. Now, it actually expands, it'll also spring back a little bit, so there's a bit of expansion and then a tiny bit of contraction that happens in the natural spring of the brass, as long as the explosion isn't too far or the chamber or the action hasn't stretched too much. But that means that it goes bang, it stretches out, shrinks back, and then you can lift the bolt and take the bullet out or take the case out. When you've got something with too much pressure or with too much expansion, too much flexibility, then you can get to where that bolt's hard to lift because that fire forming, that changing shape of the brass, has got to where it hasn't contracted back enough to where there's still pressure, which is why you're bashing up your bolt and that side of things. And there's various things that's about. But this situation, what we're describing, is the fire forming. And it's actually the changing of the shape. It's the expanding because of the explosion to the chamber size, or in some cases, like I said, even a little bit larger than the chamber size. So that's what fire forming is, and it happens on every round. So in every rifle, in every case, when you explode, when you press that trigger, you get that explosion, you get fire forming. And I suppose the other parts of those details goes into whether you're full length sizing or neck sizing. And the simple detail there is that if you have a nicely worked out chamber, you want your brass to work as little as possible, then it expands to a certain point where it fits that chamber nicely, and you just neck size, so you just take the neck back down to put another bullet in to reload it, and then it doesn't have to expand as much. Or you go full length sizing, which means you shrink it back, the brass back down to the factory size, and it goes through that same process each time of fire forming out, and they're getting pushed back down by the full length sizer. There's good and bad, yin and yang with those things. That's a different conversation, but fire forming is the process that creates that expansion. Now, in the situation of what we're talking about when it comes to improved chambering, or making an improvement, I shouldn't say an improvement so much. Improved chamber means you've changed the shape of the chamber, and the way you make your case expand out to suit your improved chamber is that you do the exact same thing, you use the fire forming process. A couple of details to it, but in its very simple basics, if we have a look over here, this is my Gibbs, which goes from a Shytac round, and that's a normal Shytac round with a 350 grain Sierra Match King in it. That's its case. It ends up at the other end here. That's one of the that's a Shytac solid copper bullet that's in there. But if you look at the case, it is now a different shape. It's got its shoulders pushed forward, the neck's a different length, everything's changed in its shape. The way that largely happened, and there's a few steps in between, the big change is actually the explosion that pushed the brass out into those corners. Over here, we have a more common sort of thing. This is a 243 and a 243 Winchester. That's only one process. That's loaded, fire forming changed the shape into a 243 Ackley improved. And you can see it loaded over there as an Ackley improved. The fire forming is the bit that creates the expansion. So that is fire forming. There's a couple of different ways to do fire forming in the very simple process of understanding. One is, and you can do either one of them. There's, once again, yin and yang, good and bad to go between them. But there is The simple form of something like the Ackley Improved, which is really designed with the concept of being able to take a factory round, put it in your Ackley Improved chamber, fire it, and then the brass that comes out is ready to be reloaded as an Ackley Improved or as an improved case. So that means you're actually able to fire the projectile and use it as a round. There's some details to go with it, but you're actually able to use it like that. The other way to do it with Ackley, or more so with the other type of thing, with the other type of improved chambers, and I'll go through the real differences we're talking about there, is to use a smaller amount of fast burning powders. So in these I'm using a little over 40 grains of a pistol powder, and then packing in what I've used with this is some toilet paper, where I've actually folded the toilet paper up and shoved it in on top and shoved it on top, so that creates the little blockage so that the powder doesn't fall out, and pushes it down on the primer, and then bang, you fire the paper, and the powder comes out the end, no projectile in it, just to do the fire forming to get it to the right shape. That you can do in an Ackley as well, where you're putting in there, I think people use cream of wheat, there's all sorts of different things that they'll pack in on top of their powder, so that then you just get a brass expansion, you're not wasting any projectiles, and you get to do it in the form where you are running less powder, but a specific just fire forming process. But even in something like this, you can actually load them and set them up to fire a bullet. Now, the details that go into that, I'll get a little bit more complex, a little bit more into explaining that. But what you're actually, and I've found in general, if you can run a similar powder load to what you end up running, you can actually fire them in a fire forming process. There's not that much difference between the, well, what am I trying to say there? Although you might end up with a little bit more of a compressed load in, let's talk about the 243 here. You just get yourself some factory cases, you put in roughly the load you're going to run in an improved case, and you'll generally find that although it's compressed, it will still go together without having to push anything or force anything, it'll still go together. And you'll tend to find they shoot very, very similarly to what they are when the brass is properly fire formed and done later on. An interesting thing that I've noticed is they actually shoot a little bit softer. So rather than that instant impact of that case that's already out there, it's all fire formed to the right shape, where it's very sharp and very hard and very fast. The actual expansion has to go through. Actually, you can feel in shooting the rifle, there's a little bit of a difference in that. As for which is better, which is worse, it's all the details, and once you move into fire forming and customizing your round, then there's a fair bit of you working out what suits you and what you're doing, whether bullets are very precious, you don't want to shoot other ones, or the brass or the powder. All the details are going to go into what makes sense for what you want to do. But I've used both ways, and both ways work. You've just got to make them suit what your process is. Okay, so that's the fire forming and what we're talking about. That's how it's done. This is the reason why it's done. Now, what is the big difference apart from the size difference? Sorry, I haven't got similar sizes to talk about this. But the detail I want to talk about here is the difference between an Ackley Improved or a common improved, or I shouldn't say common, a specific Ackley. I think there's a couple of other names to go with it, but it's essentially the style of improved round that's designed to be able to chamber a standard bullet. Whereas the likes of the Gibbs I've got here, which is actually a DCM chambering, it's one of the many improved Shitaks that there are, cannot be done. You should not be running it in just trying to run that standard round in there. Although it would sort of work, it has some potential devastation. So let's get into those details. Where will we start? The likes of the Ackley Improved, the reason it can chamber a factory round and fire, and basically with everything going the way it should do, you end up with no negatives, and you end up with an improved cartridge. It works pretty simply. And that is because if we zoom in and look closely, you'll see that the shoulder point, or where the neck comes out into the shoulder, so where you actually have the base of the neck, is a tiny bit lower than the base of the neck on the factory round. What that means is if you take a factory round and you go and chamber it, you'll actually feel it's a little tight to go down. It's a little tight because you're actually pushing in against the base of that neck to actually make it close. It's designed very specifically to be in that place. And the reason for that is that if you don't have something tension, normally in a normal factory round, you'd set them up on the head spaces, really the shoulder of the bullet coming up against the front of the cartridge with the bolt closing down on the back. That's the head space. If you end up where you've got too much slack in your head space, what actually happens when your brass expands, when it fire forms, is that the whole sides of the brass will go forward, and you'll end up with what's called a head separation. Now, head separation is, if you look at the base of the bullet, if you don't have your head space in some form or other set up, what will actually happen is the whole sides of the case will move forward and they'll end up fracturing at that weakest spot in the brass down there. And it's called a head case separation. And what ends up with is your brass ends up stuck in the chamber and the bolt, the actual head, the base of the bullet comes out. Not a very nice thing to get out of your chamber, not something you want to go through. You'll also end up, we actually damage and put a burn ring, a mark in your actual chamber where that has actually happened, if you get a head case separation. It'll happen even with one head case separation, but if you've done a whole 50 of them like that, and you end up with 2 or 3 that actually happen, you can actually end up damaging your chamber permanently by doing that. So it's a bad thing. You don't want it to happen for the various reasons. And although it is something that is far more prone to happen with any improved cartridge, it's far less likely to happen with something like an Ackley, and like I said, there's a couple of other names or companies that do that sort of stuff. Essentially any improved case that's designed that causes that, where it actually butts up against something, which in this case is the neck is a fraction longer on the factory round than it is on the improved round. Let's switch over to this other one, which is my Gibbs improved, my Gibbs is, which I've got 375 Gibbs, which is a Shytac improved round. Now the way this one is done, if you look down that line, well actually I'll just take 2 out and we'll set them over here where you can actually see that. And what you see there is that neckline. To improve it, and let's quickly go into the improving side of things. Improving's a poor terminology because it's to get more performance. Now, more isn't always an improvement. There's other negatives to go with it, and I'll get into that a little bit in a moment. But to get the most out of it, this design has pushed the neck and the shoulder point, that intersection between the neck and the shoulder has raised. So you'll see if you try to just put in the factory round in there, there's nothing stopping that whole case from moving forward. In that situation, you're going to end up with a head case separation. And I've actually seen one of those in my loading. Even though I've tried to do all the things right, there's some case where I obviously didn't pull it off properly. Now, how do we do that? What's the process of getting to there? Well, let's put them back over here and we can go through that. We'll go from the factory round. The process that I have to go through is I take this, which is just a factory case, and I run an expander through the actual neck. So I expand the neck out. In this case, I expand it out to 416. So I expand the neck out, and then I run a sizer die, neck sizer back over it to end up with this here, where I pushed the neck size back down, and I've got this little bulge in here. So that little bulge is the bit that comes up and presses up against the, so as you can see, it is stopping at a fraction higher than it is on once it is the improved case, once it's gone through its fire forming. So it's a fraction higher than the chamber. So than the actual neck shoulder intersection in the chamber. That means that when I put these rounds in, the bolt is a little bit tighter to close because it's forcing up against there. Now the logic of this is that is the point that stops the whole lot from going forward, and it forces the brass to expand out to go where it's supposed to go. So we actually get the expansion rather than the extension in the neck. Now potentially it could also just force all that forward. So it can actually end up where it still suffers from case head separation, which is the problem you can have by going to the maximum of trying to get the most out of the chamber. It has happened in one set of brass for me. I saw it. We could see the mark showing up. We had a case head separation in the early days. We saw that coming up in the brass, chucked that brass out, and it's something that I monitor and look at properly because there is the potential for doing it. But largely, if you get that right with that, putting that bump in the neck, then that stops the problem from happening. So that's that one. As you can see, there's more tools, there's more equipment, it's a bigger process. As for which one's better to do, to shoot bullets out of it and use it like that, I've actually done one of my attempts while I was fireforming, very time poor, and ended up doing that process. I haven't seen any negatives to it. It shot almost exactly the same. I could run almost exactly the same powder, because you're getting that little expansion, which means it wasn't overpressuring with the amount of powder, even though I was expanding the brass at the same time. So it all sort of worked with the way I was doing things. There's a yin and a yang that comes with it, as with all things. But that's how I did it. That is a negative of an improved chamber that is not designed to do that when it is just simply after the maximum performance. Okay, well that's a very basic generals of fireforming, what it is, and an improved chamber, and the differences of the different sorts of improved chambers. Now, is it an improvement or not an improvement? I suppose would be the question. Now, I suppose it really depends on your angle, what you're looking for, and what you're looking for with the situation. The logic of an improved chamber, I suppose the main thing that most people are after an improved chamber is more performance, so more speed. And in truth, if you just have a factory rifle and you're just looking at putting an improved reamer in there, not an awesome idea, but it is the way it was done a lot of times, just putting a ream in there to do that side of things, then generally you're not going to see much improvement from the best load you could run in a factory form to putting this here. In actual performance, you're unlikely to see a lot, because to see improvement in performance, more powder, you're generally needing to run the bullet and the twist need to be ideal and that sort of stuff, but generally need to run a bit more barrel to use a bit more powder, so a bit more length to be able to use that power really effectively. So it doesn't mean the improved cartridge design is not an improvement, but if you just put it in a standard, let's say you've got a 24-inch barrel and you are running a twist that runs a bullet weight, which isn't that heavy side of things, so you've got a what I would say, a 1 in 10, look at my 243, I suppose, as an instance. That 243 that I was running, the one I've always run, was a 243 1 in 10 twist with a 24-inch barrel. Performed awesomely, went really well. 95 grain bullets, was as long as it could go, but it performed really, really well. Now, if I just put an improved ream in there, and generally not ideal to do in the fashion of once a barrel has work hardened, then it's not nice to go in and try and cut that material out. It's hard on cutters. Your overall result doesn't tend to be brilliant. So there's some negatives once you've got enough hardness from enough age in a barrel to do that anyway. But let's say even if it was a baby, so it only fired 400 rounds or 200 rounds or something like that, so you could just go in and put that ream in there and do that side of things. Tricky in lots of different ways. Also centering perfect and all that sort of stuff gets complicated at that stage, but let's ignore all those fine details and go to the big details. That 24-inch barrel, 1 in 10 twist, it couldn't run heavier bullets anyway, and to try and run a lot more speed, you're unlikely to get it because you don't have the barrel length to burn the powder fast enough with the more powder you can put in there. So it's unlikely to be improvement. I have done an Ackley improved, but I've gone from a 24-inch barrel to a 27-inch barrel. I've gone from a 1 in 10 twist barrel to a 1 in 7 twist barrel. 1 in 8 twist, I've forgotten. I've gone higher twist in the barrel. And then I'm running a 1 in 9 grain bullet and up to a 1 in 15 grain bullet. And yes, I'm seeing a dramatic performance improvement. Really, really good, really looking forward to it. I've only just fireformed, I've only just run them in a fireformed side of things. I haven't run them in a ready to go improved case yet. I haven't gone through that process, but I'm expecting it to perform in around about the 3150 pushing 109 grain bullet, which is very, very good compared to 29 50, 29, 30, shooting a 95 grain bullet, the BC, the speed, that sort of stuff, going to work really well. So there's a real performance increase. I'd have to say, in the world of just buying rifles or doing bits and pieces, that's a 6mm Creedmoor, and it's only going to be just behind where the 243 Ackley is going to be. So if I was just buying a rifle, you can buy ammo for the 6mm Creedmoor. It means that, well, listen, it's a pretty good option. But let's leave that out of it at the moment. There's lots of different options. And if you're talking about factory ammo side of things, then you tend to go down the rabbit hole of all the new Hornady designs and things like that, because rifle manufacturers are running with them, ammo manufacturers are running with them, so there tends to be a nice little attractive little retail world that you're going with. But let's go to just the pure side of what we're talking about, which is the cartridge and the benefits to it. So yes, once I've gone to a whole rifle, then the Ackley Improved is going to show a real benefit. The bigger feature, and a feature that you would see out of them if you just went after performance, but the likes of the sharper shoulder, the straighter case, the sharper shoulder, and the tighter neck angles means that throat erosion is probably going to be reduced, because those angles of that case mean that the explosion is more likely to be pushing straight against the brass case rather than running up against the sidewall of the chamber. There's a little bit of that side of it. Really, the big difference that you're likely to see is less brass growth, because those angles are all sharper. Means that the flow of brass that happens during fire forming, quickly explain that, metal under enough pressure becomes like a fluid. So it then starts to squeeze out like a fluid. If you've got lighter angles, it's more likely to flow down those smoother angles. If you've got sharper angles, the flow tends to be stopped by those sharper angles. So brass growth and brass life is likely to be improved. Even in that standard rifle, there's a little bit of an improvement in that side of things. But that one definitely comes with that. For each yin, there's a yang, or there's a plus, there's a negative. And what we're talking about there is the improved chambers in all forms tend to cause they're a negative when it comes to feeding. Feeding issues tend to be there because of those sharper angles. These nice smooths, if we look at the Shytac, there's a nice big easy one. It's a very typical sort of case. It has a moderate amount of chamfer to it down the side. It has a nice, I think this is like a 15 degree or a 20 degree angle on there, so it's very smooth, or getting angles the wrong way around, 60 or 70. But basically, it's nice and sloped. It all flows in pretty easily. So in the way of bouncing into a chamber, it does that quite naturally. It doesn't have much resistance. The point isn't setting against sharp angles up the front here. They're the same angles as that. So it's going to slip in smoothly. If we look at an improved chamber, those are sharp angles. So unless everything's lined up properly, you've got a sharp angle, and you can tend to find that in a rifle like mine setup with single feeding and that sort of things, there's just no issues. Everything just neatly, snugly goes where it's supposed to go. But when you're trying to magazine feed, then you'll tend to find an improved chamber is a negative. There are some rounds that are like that anyway, but it tends to be the likes of the angle of the case, the angle of the neck, the angle of the shoulder, I should say. All those bits and pieces are designed to be able to, two things really they're designed for. One is so they feed nicely, so they go into the chamber nicely. But the other is that they can deal with a bit of whether it's really cold conditions or it's really dusty conditions or that sort of stuff. They're designed to be able to get around those sort of problems. There's a little bit of room to move. When you're going with an improved chamber, you're taking all those designs, all those extra little fudge factors out of it. It's a little bit like engines and modifying, which obviously for those people that know is my other job. When you start to improve things or make things go better, it's more about performance, then you start to take out your safety factors. You start to take out your fudge factors. They become less flexible to all the other things. In a car's case, it's the conditions you're using them in, it's the traction levels you have, it's the fuel you're running on, all that sort of stuff starts to have less of the anybody's thing and more into the specialized thing, which is awesome for those that are chasing performance, but not awesome for those guys who need all the FUD factors in place. So I suppose that would get back into what I'm overall saying. And I suppose also very much like cars, for those of us that want to mess with things, want to have it special, want to have it set up our way and dot the I's and cross the T's and have the bits and pieces and do the research and deal with the pain and go through that process, then the likes of the improved thing is something that works really nicely. And there is performance improvements out of it as long as you factor all the details in. For those guys who just want it to go better, and I just want a little bit more, but I really want all the other stuff to be really nice. I want it to feed really well, and I want to do this, and I want to do that, and I want to do all the other bits and pieces, and I want to be able to buy factory ammo and do all these sort of things. Well, listen, no, an improved chamber is really generally a bad idea for you. So for the average hunter, whether it's service in any form that this thing has to be able to perform in all conditions and all circumstances and be able to run ammo from off the shelf, then there is well and good enough chambers out there to not worry about the improved ones. And I suppose that's where I'd finish up on that note and say that improved, it's a little bit like the comment I say, more isn't always better. Well, improved isn't always better either. There is some real advantages in the right angle, but it's not for everyone. So I hope that's enough of info there to go through and explain it all. I'll just come back to the differences of the ones we're looking at here. The full improved chamber like this, like my Gibbs, quite a bit of work, definitely some more capacity, definitely a good lifting capacity of what it can run, and definitely some speed and things to go with it, but very much about the whole combination. The likes of the Ackley, quite a nice idea, quite simple to do. But you need to have, and listen, can do just to a factory rifle and put an improved chamber in it. Not the ideal thing, but can work really well as long as the rifle has all the other details. It doesn't, the chamber is only one small piece of it, and for a lot of them, generally they're probably working pretty well, just as the round they are, especially if off-the-shelf ammo is going to be involved. Anyway, that's about what I can tell you for fire forming and improved chambers. Hope you enjoyed the video, everyone. Share, like, do that sort of things and help us out in the way of growing the channel. And if you are after more information than this sort of stuff here, keep in mind we have our new club membership side of things on our web store. So over in our web store where we have our long range products that we build, different bits and pieces we've got over there, from our bag bases to our muzzle brakes to bag riders and that sort of stuff. We now have club membership for the people in that sort of stuff. You can ask more questions in some details where we can help out a little bit for the people who are part of our team, part of our club. But just keep that in mind. Anyway, guys, thanks for checking in on us. Hope you enjoyed. I'll catch you next time.